Thanks so much to all my patrons. Join now to help support the channel and help pick the books I review on this channel. Link in the description. Hey everybody, today I'm going to be updating my top 10 list for the best fantasy series of all time. I do this list every year. This will be my third iteration of it, and I can't wait to show you what's changed, what's new on the list, what's moved up, and what's moved down. So let's get right into it without wasting any time with number 10, and it is The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill. This is brand new to the list this year. And yeah, I've just fallen so much in love with this. I think I had read the first book when I made this list last time, but I have since read several of the books, and I'm just in love with it. This is classic epic fantasy that's being written nowadays, which is pretty cool. I love that a series is able to take these older things that you would find in things like The Wheel of Time, or before that, The Lord of the Rings, and making some modernizations to it to do some things in what I think a better way. So yeah, fans of The Wheel of Time, I think, would naturally fall in love with this series. It has just so much to love and so much in common. But for me, it just a little bit better, even though I really, really like The Wheel of Time. This series excels at being this huge, sprawling epic with this wonderfully engaging story. Something that's really nice about big, sprawling epics is oftentimes they don't get completed, or they take a really long time to get completed. Looking at you, like George R.R. Martin, and even Robert Jordan wasn't able to complete his before his very sad death. But this series, unless something tragic happens, is most certainly going to get completed. The author has written 3 of the main books in the series. I think it will end up being 4 or 5 books. There's also 3 novellas, and the author's pumping them out, like 1 book and 1 novella a year. So we should be done in the next year or so. The series is not incredibly popular. Certainly this would show up very high on a underrated series list, but it's only got about 10,000 Goodreads ratings, which is a lot for most authors, right? But like in the grand scheme of things, it's certainly not up there. And that's shown by looking at a list like every other year Reddit, the subreddit Our Fantasy does a list of the top fantasy series of all time based on votes by their users. And the last time this was done, this was ranked number 137. I expect that to go up quite a bit, but I'd be surprised if it cracked the top 50 on a list like that. But it's got a huge cult following. I mean, this is one of those chosen one stories that involves dragons and large sections of books following one character and splitting off to the next one, dealing with the a kind of a world takeover of these people that happened a long time ago, hundreds of years into the future. This book is where, there's a resistance and they're trying to fight back and all the odds are stacked against them. You've read stories like this before, but this one is among the best that you're ever going to read. Just awesome stuff. Number 9 is The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. Last year, this was number 3, so it is down 6 spots. I didn't reread it. I just read other stuff that kind of moved up and bumped it down. And in my rethinking of this, like I like to do from time to time, this is where I think it should be on my list. This, again, is kind of a more modern epic fantasy, but whereas the Bound and the Broken was more of this old school kind of epic fantasy story, this one's kind of like a more modern epic fantasy, in the vein of more like a Song of Ice and Fire, where it deals with a lot of kind of more political elements, some really interesting, these religious aspects going along with it, but does that thing where it follows a large, crop of characters moving around, following multi-POV, but it really, really excels at this hero story. Now, I know that's a very common trope, but it's done so well. I mean, you've got this character that starts in a little village with his friends, and everything seems fine, and then everything starts to kind of sweep up and take this character in a different place. And again, that's a very common thing when it comes to fantasy, but it's done so well. I mean, it takes a long time to build up in this. This is a 4-book series in The Faithful and the Fallen. It's already been completed. But by the first book, it's moving at a pretty slow pace, but by the end of it, you understand the scope of things. You get how all these different pieces play. And a very fun take on things. John Gwynne has made some of the POVs from bad characters or the so-called baddies, even though, it remains to be seen who's good and who's bad. It's got that A Song of Ice and Fire thing going for it, where there's a lot of shades of gray. But following both sides of this conflict is a really, really fun device that makes you feel really drawn into all of these characters instead of just boxing some out and trying to, fit them into these cute little bow ties and what they should be, because it allows you to be able to sympathize or even hate some characters more than you would otherwise been able to do. Like I said, this has already been completed. John Gwynne has moved on to a totally different series. He ended up writing a trilogy after this that follows in the same world but deals with a little bit of a different story called Of Blood and Bone, which is far less popular. This one's not insanely popular. I'd say it's relatively popular. It's got 40,000 Goodreads ratings. The vast majority of people have never heard of this, but if you're into fantasy, you've heard about it, and you might have read it. And on Reddit, on that post, it was ranked number 36, but I don't think it's going to get any higher on that list. Time is not going to be moving this thing up the list, I suppose. This is probably going to move down the list because the books are done, and John Gwynne moved on to something else. But we'll see. But yeah. Really, really, really fun story for people that like things like A Song of Ice and Fire, even though it's very different. And yeah, awesome spins on religion that are done in a much better way than most other fantasy stories out there. Number 8 is The Sun Eater by Christopher Ruocchio. This is brand new to the list. This is a 6-book series currently, but it'll eventually be 7 with a good handful of novellas and short story collections. Ruocchio just loves writing. And even the novellas are just wonderfully done. This is sci fantasy, and in my opinion, the best that sci fantasy has to offer. Now, I know that's a rather limited field, but with not a ton of competition, but it's incredible. And even, combining this just with fantasy, I have this really high up on my list. This, I think, would appeal to fans of something like a Dune. Clearly, there was a lot of inspiration drawn from Dune. It's a very, very different story than Dune. Now, maybe I would take that back if I had read more than just the first book in Dune, because this really is a sprawling space opera, epic story that happens to be in space. I mean, stories are taking place, tons and tons and tons of light years away. There's these huge time jumps that are only possible due to going into an ice kind of fugue where time doesn't pass by for them, but it goes by. So we're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of years here, as the characters don't really age. Their ages technically go up, but they don't physically age, and so they can last for a really, really long time and deal with these grand sweeping events that you would otherwise not be able to really do. This is not a very popular series. It's only got 13,000 ratings on Goodreads, and number 81 on the Reddit thread. This is rising in popularity, though. This series is getting bigger. I know Daniel Green recently was raving about it, and Daniel Green's the biggest name in the fantasy YouTube space. I know lots of other people are all about this thing. It feels like everybody that reads this ends up liking it. Now, obviously, that's not true because there's different opinions, and this story would have a 5 out of 5 stars on things like Goodreads and Amazon if that were the case. And clearly that's not, because no book's ever done that. But it feels like when people give this a chance, it almost always works at a way higher rate than pretty much anything else because it's just wonderful. I mean, the writing style is immaculate. Now, prose is subjective. I get that. For me, it pops. The story gets bigger and bigger as we go along and doesn't rush things too quickly. The magical elements there that weren't really present in the first book, because the first book kind of establishes this alien type story. There's this huge universal conflict between humans and this alien race, the 𝐒𝐨𝐿syn. It's told in this Name of the Wind type of story where the character is telling their life story to somebody else. And this character is a very complicated character because he has blown up a sun, killed billions, if not trillions, of his own people, as well as wiped out the alien race. And so kind of reviled, kind of loved, and you get to hear it from his perspective, which can be a very biased perspective as well. Awesome writing technique, super engaging story, and I can't wait to see where the story goes. I'm not even caught up with where the author is, but hopefully I'll be caught up by the time that final book comes out in the next year or so. And yeah, you should have every confidence in the world that the series is going to be finished. Ruocchio is a very prolific author, and he's super committed to seeing this one out. And I think there's only one book left, so he doesn't have much left to write. Speaking of sweeping huge books with an author that writes a lot, number 7 is The Wandering Inn by Pyar Abba. Last year, this was number 9, so this is up 2 spots. And I am just so impressed by this and embarrassed a little bit, but I'm wiping out that embarrassment a little bit because this is not your traditional fantasy story. This feels like a video game. In fact, I've always said that if you're a fan of like RPG video games or like classic Dungeons and Dragons, how could you not love The Wandering Inn? It's just this perfect little slice of life story that brings in so many different elements into the story. You know, it's got these horror sections. It's got these huge epic fantasy stories. It's got these very sad, very, introspective kind of stories about people trying to find their way in life. It deals with so many different things, and you could be saying like, how could one little story deal with so much? Well, because it's the longest fantasy story of all time. That's why, by a long shot. Currently, The Wandering Inn is about 3 times the length of The Wheel of Time, which is known for being an incredibly long series, and it's being written at an insanely fast pace. The author writes a new chapter every other week, and the chapters are very large. The chapters are like 50 plus pages. And so you can do the math here and figure out that this author is just flying through this series. And it's done in this way that is without much edits. The writing can be a little bit more raw. But over time, the author's gotten so good that they don't even need to really do much to the story. They are so good at writing that it just kind of flows out. You can literally actually watch the author writing these. If you subscribe to their Patreon, they'll go on the computer, show the screen, and watch the writing in real time. And people are like chiming in with edits or these things that are spelled wrong, and they'll go back and fix it in real time. I heard it described by somebody on the Wandering Inn's team that it feels like one of the you're being told a story by a campfire, and we're all kind of hearing it together for the first time. And you really do get that sense, and it's this amazing experience that is unrivaled in all of fantasy for what you're getting. And yeah, it's hard to tell people sometimes that I'm reading this like lit RPG, story that seems silly on its surface, and it does feel silly when you start reading it, but very quickly it just pops, and it's worth it. And it's free because you can just read everything on the website and as they come out. So that's pretty cool. What else are you going to get this length for free? Nothing, unless you steal it. But you don't have to steal this one. It's right there for you. Number 6 is a series that you might not have ever heard of about before, and it is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin. Last year, this was number 8. This moved up 2 spots. And so why did this move up 2 spots? I didn't reread it. It should have gone down, if anything, right? But I've just done a lot of thinking lately about this, and I constantly think of A Song of Ice and Fire as kind of my barometer for what is incredible or less than incredible. You know, if you're better than A Song of Ice and Fire, you are in this special tier. And it's just a series that I constantly will judge everything against, which is a very good thing for it. And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about it, and I just feel like I have to move it up. And I don't know why I ended up kind of further down my list in the year before. This is a series that I would kind of more describe as like political fantasy, where it's not all about that, but it's a lot about that. And it's one of the things I love the most. I mean, I work in politics. I love when I'm able to mix, my passion for work with my passion for literature and fantasy, and it combines into something truly, truly special. I don't gotta talk too much about what makes this series awesome, because you've probably already read it or watched the show. The show's awesome, at least the first 4 seasons. Then it all went downhill. I'm one of those guys. But yeah, if you've, I will say a couple things though, and I'll say that, if you're one of those people that is like, I watched the show, I don't need to read the books, you're missing out. You're missing out. And I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say that there's a ton more in the books that wasn't covered in the show. And while there is a lot, especially as it goes later on, it's much better done in the books. And even though I love the show, there's just so much content packed in there. There's all these little stories that combine to make a much better, more rich world that you're not able to get in the show. So, yeah, even if all of the plot points are spoiled for you, it's wonderful. And I can prove that by telling you that people that reread this series, which I have done, are more rewarded the second time through than the first time. So just because you know what's going to happen doesn't take away from what's so magical about this series. So yeah, certainly well worth checking this out. And I will also say the people that are like, yeah, I've missed the boat. the hype is kind of gone and it's never going to get finished. So why would I get involved in a series that's never going to be finished? And while I do subscribe to the concept that it won't be finished, I believe the next book will come out, but I don't think the last one will. Even if he is going to somehow finish it in 2 more books, which I have doubts on even that. But I have no faith that he'll finish this series. But even then, I'll say it's worth it. It's well worth it. You'll hear so many people say that their favorite book of all time is A Storm of Swords, which is the 3rd book in the series. A lot of people. When I did a video last year that asked people, or like a year and a half ago now, that asked a bunch of booktubers, what's your favorite book series, or a favorite book of all time? And a lot of them said A Storm of Swords is their number 1 favorite book of all time. And so why did they say that, even though the series isn't done? Because even just reading it, even without getting that satisfaction of an ending, it is well worth it. So yeah, jump in if you haven't. You are missing a lot. Number 5 is Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This was the same exact score as last year. I'm keeping this at number 5. This can best be described as epic fantasy. It is, in its core, that's what this is. And it's almost kind of that older feel to the epic fantasy where, there's pretty well-defined good guys, pretty well-defined bad guys. The good guys are always going to win. It's a lot of rooting for the heroes to do what you know that they're going to be able to do. And while that does take away some of the tension that would be there, not knowing, by knowing already kind of who's going to be the victors, somehow Sanderson is such a master at writing his plots that he just keeps you constantly guessing. He keeps you constantly on your toes because there's so many little things going on that he's been preparing for books and books and books only to kind of hammer you with when you least expect it. He's the king at that. He plots his stories out so wonderfully well that it's just a masterclass in writing. And it's the reason that this is like the most popular adult fantasy series out there by a pretty long shot right now. It's any survey that's done will show that this is the most popular in any kind of way that you collect the data. I've asked people, what's their favorite series? It's always this one. I've asked people, rate series for me and tell me like which ones you liked and which ones you didn't. So I can get a percentage of people that have read a book that tell me whether they liked it or not. So I get a sense of like a different data set that will always be number 1. It appeals to so many different people, and clearly it does to me too. Even though it has no grimdark kind of elements to it, even fans of that will still find a lot to love here. It's one of the only series that legitimately all of the books end up making me teary-eyed, not because of something bad happening, but because of good things happening. And you get this sense of redemption constantly in these stories. It's so well done that you've got to jump on board with this if you haven't. It's got 4 books done. The 5th one will be coming out later this year. It's a planned 10-book series. The books come out every few years. Every 3 or 4 years, one will come out. So we've got a long time for the series to finish. But Sanderson is such a consistent writer that the series will finish up. I mean, he plans his whole life out. He knows when this series will finish, and it's probably going to finish exactly when he says it will finish. Sometime in the 2040s, which seems like a really long time away, but not that long away. And yeah, just such a well-done experience. It's like the antithesis of something like A Song of Ice and Fire, where that series is written as the author kind of comes up with it. And it shows as the series goes along. And it gets a little bit, kind of losing the plot a little bit. Whereas something like this keeps getting stronger as the series goes along, as you see all the plot threads kind of come together. Number 4 is Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. Again, this was number 4 last year. It's staying the same. And yeah, this is what I would describe as like emotional fantasy, where there's a lot of sad things going on in this. It's kind of the hallmark of it. It is an emotional book, an emotional series. It is a 16-book series that is 4 trilogies and 1 quartet, or what, there's a couple of names for what a 4-book series is, but I'm picking quartet. That's the one that jumped to my mind right now. It is very popular. It is not quite on the level of like A Song of Ice and Fire or Stormlight Archive, but this has 325,000 Goodreads ratings. It's number 7 on the Reddit threads for the most popular fantasy series of all time. So on any metric that you would look at, this is going to be very high up on the list. How is a series that deals with sadness and pain and doesn't have the most compelling plots in the world able to captivate so many people, including me? Well, it's because Robin Hobb is probably the best character writer in all of fantasy. The characters are so well done and so lifelike to the point where it's scary on how good she is. Her prose is magnificent. It is somehow not this flowery, poetic type of writing that some other authors will be able to utilize, one of which will show up later on in my list here in this video. But also not simple. It makes you think, it makes you feel, but doesn't try to be smarter than it is or dumb things down. It hits the perfect level on things. The series, like I mentioned, is split up into these 5 different series, 3 of which, the first, the third, and the 5th, deal with this character, 𝐵𝘁𝑐ℎ𝑖 Farseer. This is a bastard son of a prince, and he's trying to find his way in the world. He gets accepted back into the royal family after being kind of on the outs for a while. But they're not going to let him be like a formal prince. They're going to just let him kind of support his siblings and help out behind the scenes and become an assassin. Well, that doesn't last very long. He ends up doing a lot more with his life than just kind of being an assassin. In fact, I don't even know if he actually undertakes any assassinations. It's not really what this story's about at all. It's about a totally different thing. But then you've got these 2 other series that, in the 2nd and the 4th series that deal with a different part of the world, that feels like a totally disconnected story that as it goes along does get connected and it all makes sense and it all fits together. And it's incredible that it's able to do that because this author does kind of write on a whim. The series was never supposed to be this long, and they just Robin Hobb just kind of threw on some more arcs into the story, and somehow it all just wound itself up to be this perfect story. It's just awesome stuff. Bring your tissues with you. You're going to cry. Bad things are going to happen to this character. The character will keep trying to pick themselves up, learn how to deal with the emotional trauma that is life sometimes. And you get to watch this character grow from a little boy into an old man. It's a wonderful experience. If it hits right for you, a lot of people get very bored with it pretty quickly. But if you don't, you're in for an incredible journey. Number 3 is The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. Last year, this is number 2, so it's down 1. And this is kind of the quintessential grimdark fantasy. Even though the author would not describe it as grimdark, he doesn't get to pick what it is. The readers do, and it's grimdark. This is a very popular series that has 250,000 Goodreads ratings, and it is number 3 on the Reddit post for the best fantasy series of all time. The First Law is another story that I would say doesn't have the most incredible of plots. It's good, it's entertaining, but that's not what makes this thing stand out. What makes this thing stand out is, again, the characters. And clearly, I didn't realize this about myself until recently, but I'm very much a characters first type of reader. But it's not just me. Tons of people love this thing. It just does characters in the most perfect ways. You've got these characters that are some of the most memorable characters in all of fantasy. Even if you have not read this series, my guess is that you have stumbled across the name Logan Ninefinger somewhere. My guess is that you will have stumbled across the name Glokta. And because these characters are just iconic and so perfect. What further makes this series even better is the audiobooks. Now, it seems strange that how can an audiobook amplify a book, but that's because you've never listened to this one, have you? If you're questioning that. Because Stephen Pacey delivered the most incredible audiobook performance that has ever been done and ever will be done when doing this series. And it blows it out of the water. It's one of the only series I'll say that is almost a must to read on audio. I'm sure the physical books are great, but you're missing out on an entirely different component if you don't listen to this in audiobook. So just perfect. This is currently a 9, or I'll say a 10 book series. People get mad at me when I say 9 because one of them is a short story collection. But 9 novels split up into a trilogy, which is the First Law trilogy. Then you got 3 standalones that deal with the world and tie things kind of together before you get to the final trilogy, which is called the Age of Madness trilogy. And I'm putting these all kind of in the same kind of bucket for me. I'm currently doing a reread of all of these. I have now given, on my reread, I've read 8 of them, 8 of the 9. I've given them all 5 stars, except for one of the standalones, Red Country, which I thought was like a 4-star book. And yeah, I can't get enough of it. I can't get over how well these are done. It is somehow done with this dark story but also is incredibly funny and lighthearted. And blending these two different diametrically opposing things into one story is just perfection in story form, and it demands to be read. Number 2 is The Dandelion Dynasty. Last year, this is number 6, so this is up 4. And it's gone up because I finished the series. I had only read the first 2 books in this 4-book series when I did this last time. I loved them so much that I put it in number 6, even have not finished it. And now that I'm done, I can pretty definitively say that it is number 2. Not by a lot. My number 1 is solidly number 1, but number 2 and 3 can, depending on which day you ask me, I might flip them. Today, it's Dandelion Dynasty. This is, and I don't think this is like the real term for it, but I kind of think of this as like historical fantasy, where it is telling, at least in the first book, a very clear retelling of ancient China and the Han Dynasty and the fall of the Han Dynasty. Is it the fall or the rise of the Han Dynasty? I don't know. Clearly, I don't know my Chinese history very well. But it is like point for point kind of retelling of that story in a fantasy setting in the first book. Then it goes on to do its own thing. But I would think of it in this historical standpoint. There are fantastical elements here with mythical beasts and in powers that people have and in the way that they can do things. And so it's definitely a fantasy book, but yeah, it feels historical. This is not very popular. It only has 20,000 Goodreads ratings, and it's number 84 on the Reddit thread. Maybe this will go up a little bit, but probably not a lot. And this just hit differently than any other series that I've ever read, because the first book is just one of the most incredible things I've ever read. It read like a fast-paced history book, where you took out all of the boring things from any sort of history story, and you put them on fast forward. And the best way I can describe it is that, like, in any other fantasy story you're ever going to read, characters will, let's say a character is going to storm a castle, right? Which is something that we've all read before, right? And they'll have a chapter or multiple chapters talking about what their plans are. And then we'll get a couple chapters of them starting to pull off the plans. And we'll get a couple chapters of them kind of wrapping things up. But in the Dandelion Dynasty, on one page, they'll hatch the plan. On the next page, they will enact the plan. And on the final page, we'll move on to something else. It is flying through this story. And it's you can't stop reading it. It's like you get like your mind taken over with madness on like, how is it going? Your heart's beating. It's like flying and you're just taking it all in, but somehow it doesn't feel too fast. Somehow it feels perfect. And ultimately what the author's trying to do is he's trying to tell a very complex story about this family and how they got to be the way that they are before telling the real story, which is in books 2, 3, and 4. And so the author could have so easily just skipped the first book and said, let's just tell the story in this trilogy. But instead they said, no, let's do a favor to the reader and tell them the whole story of the world up to that point. And it makes you so emotionally invested, not just in the characters, but the family and the world building and just the whole vibe of the entire series just condensed into this one incredible book. But then you get the next books, which are arguably even better. So incredible stuff. And I just can't stop talking about the series. And I wish more people would read it because it's not as popular as I feel it should be. And the final series, which I'm sure you could have guessed by now if you've ever watched anything that I've ever done, because this has been my number 1 since I started this channel, and it's still my number 1. It is Malazan by Steven Erikson and 𝐂𝐮 Esselmont. And yeah, this is I don't even know, I've done this whole video telling you like what type of fantasy it is. I don't know what type of fantasy Malazan is. It's like crazy fantasy or something. It's like fantasy dialed up to 11. It's the biggest, baddest fantasy story you could ever imagine. Dozens and dozens of different races of people and gods and elder gods and monsters and demons and these crazy races of people. You got this guy that's like Conan's big brother. You've got these people that like these ice people with these magical powers that are fighting this life and death struggle for hundreds and thousands of years between this undead army of like Neanderthals, and all the while you've got these like these bug-like people that are really good at creating like ammunition and explosives that sell it to these human mercenary type people that are going to war with the gods and with everybody else trying to expand their empire. And all the while you've got this crazy god that's threatening to take over the world and end it, and everyone's trying to figure out how to stop him and figure out his motivations. And all these gods are fighting for power, and these elder gods coming in and that have been replaced because not enough people follow them and they're trying to get followers. And I could talk in that manic way that I just talked for another 15 minutes if you didn't stop me. I should make a video just like that sometime and just let my mind keep going, because that's what the series is. It's wild. And it takes a while to even figure out what the series is about, which is cool on its own end. It's a pretty popular series. It's 120,000 Goodreads rating. It's number 9 on the Reddit thread. But you find that a lot of people that like this don't just like it, they're obsessed with it. It's a 10-book series. They're pretty big-sized books. In the main series, and then you have some spin-off series. It's written by 2 different authors. So Stephen Erickson wrote 𝐿 Book of the Fallen, which is by far the most popular. 𝐒𝐮 𝐥, his friend, wrote these other series that kind of tell different stories that are kind of blended into it. Erickson himself has written kind of a long prequel story, not long, a prequel story that tells the prequel story hundreds of thousands of years in the past. He's now writing a series that kind of follows up right after the end of it, dealing with a very isolated part of the world. The story takes place on many, many, many different continents. It's truly a world thing going on here. Erickson was an archaeologist, and he studied philosophy, and he blends these things in to be able to tell this incredible history while also delivering the greatest prose that exists in fantasy. It makes you think more than anything else out there. It's magically done. I can't say enough more positive things about this. I'm currently doing a reread of this. The reread is 10 times better than the initial read, which is crazy, because there's so much packed in here and so much that you can't figure out, because the author writes it in a pretty confusing way, where the author says, trust me, I'll explain it, but I'm not going to tell you right away. I'm going to drop you in this world, and I'm not going to hold your hand. I'm just going to talk to you about what's going on. You walked in, it's like walking into a movie partway through, a movie that's been going on for hundreds of years, and you sit down and the movie doesn't stop to explain it for you. The movie just keeps going, but it'll start to make sense about why these things are going on. And it almost makes you feel like, man, I wish I could go watch the whole thing. But I'm glad that it didn't try to treat me dumber than I am. That we'll get it later on and we'll figure it out. And it's a wonderful experience to go through, and something that is unreplicated in all of fantasy. And it's one of the many reasons that this is number 1 on my list, and will probably stay that way for a really long time. So that's my 10. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love you down in the comments to tell me what your favorites are. What did not show up on this list? What was surprising to you? Hit me up. I'd love to know. So thank you. And as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to all my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier and Librarian tier patrons: Anna G, CJ, Doust, Darren, JD, Jonathan, Nathan T, Nev's Book Channel, 𝗓𝗏𝗏, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L, Sydney Baker, Tay C, Tahir, Tommy Rose, Zion, Anna, Andra, Blair, Brock, Evan, Joe UK, Kat Mick, Michael Sugarman, Sky, Tyler, and Wacky. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video, and if you want to watch some more content from my channel, click over here and I've got some good videos for you. Thanks so much.